Get ready for a deep dive, folks, because today we're headed to Rio.
Rio de Janeiro, to be
Oh,
precise. But we're not just hitting the beaches or soaking up the sun.
right. We're going way deeper than that. We're exploring a neighborhood known as Little Africa.
A place that's bursting with history, culture, and a community that thrived despite unimaginable hardship.
And our guide for this journey is, well, it's not a person. We're going to be using excerpts from a Rio walking tour guide that focuses on the African diaspora there.
It's amazing, really, full of fascinating stories and insights.
Exactly. When I first started reading through this material, there were a few things that really jumped out at me. Like, have you ever heard of a Prito Novo
Hmm, I can't say I have.
or an Escrava de Ganho?
Those are new to me. What do they mean?
Well, they're actually key to understanding this complex social hierarchy that existed within the slave system in Rio.
That's something I think a lot of people don't realize. It wasn't just black and white, enslaved or free. There are all these layers and nuances to it.
Exactly. And we're going to unpack all of that. But before we dive into the specifics of Little Africa, I think it's helpful to set the stage to understand how Rio itself developed.
Right, because it wasn't always this bustling metropolis we know today.
Exactly. So let's rewind back to the early days. When the Portuguese first arrived in Brazil, they weren't exactly lining up to settle in Rio, were they?
No, not at all. They were more interested in what they could extract from the land. They were searching for gold and silver, quick riches.
And Rio didn't exactly fit the bill.
Not initially. It actually took them almost 2 centuries to strike gold, so to speak. But as other European powers like the French began to show interest in Brazil, the Portuguese started to see Rio's strategic importance.
Ah, so a little competition got them motivated.
You could say that. The French, under the leadership of Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon, even established a colony right here in Guanabara Bay.
Wait, a French colony in Rio? I never knew that.
It's true. They set up shop on an island right there in the bay. But it didn't last long.
Well, I can imagine the Portuguese weren't too keen on sharing.
Not in the slightest. They fought fiercely to drive the French out. And they even formed alliances with some of the indigenous groups in the area.
That's fascinating. Who did they ally with?
Groups like the Tupinamba and Teminino people, they are key players in this power struggle.
It sounds like a chaotic time.
Oh, it definitely was. But in the midst of all this conflict, the Portuguese officially established a settlement in Rio.
When was that?
In 1565, they built a fortified settlement at the base of Sugarloaf Mountain, and that officially is the birthday of Rio de Janeiro.
Wow, so Rio started at the foot of Sugarloaf Mountain. That's pretty amazing, but I'm guessing they didn't stay there for long, right?
You're right. They soon realized they needed a more defensible position. So they moved the settlement to Morro do Castelo,
Which means?
Castle Hill. It was a strategic hilltop location, perfect for a fortress.
Makes sense. A hilltop fortress probably offered a good vantage point and made it harder for enemies to attack.
Exactly. They built fortifications, a church, government buildings, residences. It was Rio's first downtown, so to speak.
Okay, so we've got the city taking shape, but it didn't stay confined to a hilltop, did it?
Definitely not. Rio started to spread, expanding down the hill and into the surrounding areas.
Even though those lower-lying areas were basically marshland, right? I've heard they were prone to flooding.
It's true. It was challenging terrain. But the city continued to grow, pushing outwards despite the obstacles, and those marshlands actually played a key role in how Rio developed.
Really? How so? It's hard to picture present-day Rio as a marshland.
I know. It's a far cry from what we see today. But to understand the emergence of Little Africa, we have to go back to those early days and talk about how Rio became entangled in this horrific chapter of history, the transatlantic slave trade.
That's a heavy topic, but it's essential to understanding the roots of Little Africa, isn't it?
It is. By the late 16th century, Rio had become a central point in the trade of enslaved Africans, an activity that would tragically continue for 3 centuries.
The scale of it all is hard to fathom.
It's truly horrific. Imagine millions of people were forcibly taken from Africa during that time, and nearly 5 million of them were brought to Brazil alone.
Those numbers are just staggering.
And the journey itself was unimaginably brutal. So many people perished on those ships before they even reached Brazil. They were known as tumbeiros, which literally means floating tombs.
Just that name alone sends chills down my spine.
It should. And when these ships arrived in Rio, the main entry point for those enslaved Africans was the Valongo Wharf.
Belongo Wharf, where was that?
It was right in the heart of the city in the Gamboa neighborhood.
And this was where those who survived the journey first set foot on Brazilian soil.
Sadly, yes. It's estimated that between 500,000 and 1 million people stepped onto those stones, ripped from their homes, their families, their entire world. It's a place heavy with history.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale of suffering that took place there.
It is. And it's a testament to the enduring strength and resilience of those who were brought there against their will.
So, this Valongo Wharf, it was basically a gateway to a life of forced labor and unimaginable hardship.
Sadly, yes. And it wasn't just the wharf itself. The entire area around it was designed to control and process these newly arrived individuals. There was a lazaretto, a type of quarantine station for those who were sick, and the Cementerios de Pretos Novos.
Cemeteries of New Blacks, what a chilling name.
They were cemeteries specifically for those who didn't survive the journey. The conditions on those ships were so horrific that many died during the transatlantic crossing.
It's a stark reminder of the dehumanization inherent in the slave trade. They weren't seen as people, they were seen as commodities.
You're right. They were bought and sold like cattle. And there was actually a bustling market right nearby where enslaved people were auctioned off.
Right there in the city.
Right in the heart of it. It's hard to believe, isn't it?
It's a dark chapter in Rio's history, that's for sure. But it's crucial to understand how it shaped the city and how it led to the emergence of Little Africa.
You're absolutely right. And to understand how this community began to take root, we need to talk about the social hierarchy that existed within the slave system. You mentioned terms like Preto Novo and Escrava de Ganho earlier. Remember,
I do, but I have to admit, I'm not entirely clear on what they mean.
well, there are important distinctions. For instance, Preto Novo wasn't simply a way of saying someone had dark skin. It meant something very specific.
Okay, so it was more than just a descriptive term.
Right. Preto Novo referred to a person who had recently been brought from Africa, someone new to Brazil.
So it was a way of distinguishing them from those who had been born in Brazil?
Exactly. And those born in Brazil, the first generation of children born to African parents, they were called criollos.
Criollos. I've heard that term before, but I always thought it referred to people of mixed race.
It's more complicated than that. While a criollo could be of mixed race, the term actually focused on where they were born. Didn't really matter what their skin color was. If they were born in Brazil to African parents, they were considered criollos.
That's interesting. So the focus was on their birthplace, not their racial background.
Exactly. And then there's the term pardo, and that's where things get even more interesting. Because while we often associate pardo with mixed-race heritage, it actually indicated something else entirely.
What did it mean then?
Pardo meant a person was free. They were born free.
So it wasn't about their racial background, it was about their legal status.
Precisely. And that distinction, that legal status, it carried a lot of weight. Pardos actually held a higher social standing than both pretos and criollos within this twisted hierarchy.
Wow, that really changes my understanding of those terms. So it wasn't just about skin color, it was about where you were born and whether you were born into slavery or freedom?
You got it. It's a nuance that often gets overlooked, but it's crucial to understanding the social dynamics of the time. And these distinctions played out in various ways, even in the formation of religious brotherhoods.
Religious brotherhoods? What do you mean?
Well, enslaved people weren't allowed to practice their traditional African religions. They were forced to convert to Catholicism.
Right. But didn't they find ways to blend their beliefs?
They did. They found subtle ways to incorporate their traditions and rituals into Catholic practices. It was a way of preserving their heritage and finding spiritual solace within a system that sought to erase their cultural identity.
It's amazing how resourceful they were in finding ways to resist and hold on to their culture.
It is. But these religious brotherhoods, while they provided a space for spiritual expression and community, they also reflected that social hierarchy we were talking about.
Really? How so?
There were brotherhoods exclusively for pretos and others that only allowed pardos. The pardos often wouldn't accept pretos or criollos into their ranks.
So they were replicating the social hierarchy of the outside world even within their religious communities.
Sadly, yes. But despite these divisions, enslaved people found ways to fight for their freedom and create a space for themselves within this oppressive system. And that's where the story of Little Africa really begins to take shape.
So amidst all of this rigid social structure, this brutal slave trade, How did Little Africa begin to emerge? How did enslaved people create a sense of community? And how did they preserve their cultural heritage in such a hostile environment?
Well, it's really a testament to their incredible resilience and their determination. I mean, Little Africa didn't just appear overnight,
Hmm.
right? It was a gradual process shaped by various factors. And, those religious brotherhoods we were just discussing, they actually played a vital role in this process.
They were more than just religious organizations, weren't they?
Right. They provided this vital social space for enslaved people, a place to connect with others who shared similar experiences, who came from similar cultural backgrounds. It was within those brotherhoods that we really start to see the seeds of Little Africa being sown.
It's like, even though they were ripped from their homelands, they found ways to maintain that cultural identity and connect with each other.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that enslaved people in Rio, just like in other parts of Brazil, they resisted their oppression in many ways. They weren't passive victims. They actively sought freedom and challenged that system that was trying to dehumanize them.
I'm always in awe of those stories of resistance. What forms did that resistance take in Rio?
Well, running away was a common tactic,
Mm.
especially for those who had recently arrived from Africa. Those who were desperate to escape the horrors of slavery. They were often referred to as pretos vocês because they didn't speak Portuguese. Imagine trying to escape when you don't even know the language or the land.
I can't even imagine the courage that must have taken and the constant threat of recapture.
Exactly. It was incredibly risky. And there's just countless stories of enslaved people risking everything for that chance at freedom. You can find newspaper articles from that time filled with advertisements from slave owners offering rewards for the capture of runaways.
A reminder that these weren't just numbers, right? They were real people with families, hopes, dreams, and that incredible desire to be free.
Absolutely. And for many of those who ran away, they sought refuge in the Colombos.
Ah, the Colombos. Tell me more about them. I know they were settlements formed by escaped slaves, but what were they really like?
Well, they were much more than just hiding places. I mean,
Mhm.
some Colombos were incredibly sophisticated. They had their own systems of governance, agriculture, trade, you name it. They really varied in size and structure depending on their location and what resources they had access to.
So they weren't just a few people hiding out in the forest.
No, some were actually quite large and organized. Imagine entire communities living outside the control of that slave system. It's incredible.
It's amazing. It's inspiring to think about. Did they have any contact with the outside world?
Some did. Those located near urban centers, they sometimes traded their agricultural produce or crafts with local merchants. And there were even accounts of Colombos in rural areas selling their labor to nearby farmers who, they kind of turned a blind eye to their status as runaway slaves.
That sounds like such a delicate balancing act, maintaining their freedom while also needing to interact with that world that had enslaved them.
It was. And alongside running away, forming these Colombos, enslaved people also resisted in other ways. Did you know that they could actually take their owners to court if they felt they were being mistreated?
Really? I had no idea.
Yeah. There were actually laws stipulating that slave owners had to provide their slaves with food, clothing, and shelter, as basic necessities. And if those needs weren't met, the enslaved people could seek legal recourse.
So even within this incredibly oppressive system, they had some legal protections.
They did. And from the mid-19th century onward, there were actually numerous cases of judges ruling in favor of enslaved people who had been abused or neglected by their owners.
So there were moments where justice prevailed, glimmers of hope amidst such darkness.
Absolutely. And, sometimes that resistance took on a much more drastic form. I mean, there are documented cases of enslaved people fighting back violently against their oppressors, even killing their owners in retaliation for abuse.
That's just a reminder that the human spirit can only endure so much.
You're right. And while those individual acts of resistance were significant, there was always that underlying fear of larger scale uprisings, especially after the Haitian Revolution.
Right. That revolution really sent shockwaves throughout the Americas. It showed that enslaved people could rise up, they could overthrow their oppressors, and establish their own independent nation.
Exactly. And this fear of rebellion, it actually had a direct impact on the development of Little Africa. Remember how we talked about those geographical designations given to enslaved people?
You mean like the Angolas, the Congos, the Minas?
Exactly. Well,
Right.
in the 19th century, a particular group became associated with unrest and rebellion, the Minas.
The Minas. But I thought they were known for their skilled craftsmanship.
They were. They were blacksmiths, carpenters, musicians. Really talented. But after a series of uprisings in Bahia, Slave owners in the Northeast started selling their meanest slaves to cocky plantation owners in the Paraíba Valley, which is in the state of Rio de Janeiro.
So they were seen as a threat and basically shipped off to another part of the country.
You got it. Moved south, away from their communities, their support networks, in an attempt to, quell any potential uprisings.
It seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't scattering them like that make it harder to control them?
You'd think so, but the slave owners were more concerned about preventing any kind of organized resistance. And it was this migration of the Minas, along with other groups from Bahia like the Nagos, that really contributed to the growth of Little Africa in Rio.
So it was a forced relocation that ultimately helped to strengthen this community.
In a way, yes. These newcomers, carrying their cultural traditions, memories of resistance, they found solace and connection in Rio's growing urban center.
A reminder that even attempts to suppress and control can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And these newcomers, seeking work, affordable housing, they settled in the Saúde neighborhood, which was near the docks. And it was there, in that bustling heart of Rio, that Little Africa really started to flourish.
That's what I find so fascinating about this story. You have this community forged in this just crucible of slavery, but finding ways to thrive and create something beautiful, something enduring.
It's
Yeah.
really remarkable, and it's in Little Africa that we see those cultural traditions. The music, the food,
Mhm.
the religious practices all blending together, creating this really unique cultural landscape.
And those traditions, they continue to influence Rio's identity to this day, right?
Absolutely. I mean, think of samba, for instance. It's one of the most iconic cultural expressions of Brazil, and its roots, they lie right there in Little Africa.
I'd love to know more about that connection. How did samba emerge from this community?
Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was really a fusion of influences. You had the rhythms, the melodies brought from Africa, blended with the dances and musical traditions of the indigenous people, even some European influences thrown in. But it was in Little Africa that samba really took shape, nurtured by that community and its vibrant spirit.
And it's tied to the story of the Baianas, right? Those strong women who migrated from Bahia.
Exactly. They were instrumental in the development of samba. These women, often enslaved, they would set up as food vendors, selling sweets and treats, bringing their culinary skills, their entrepreneurial spirit. Later on, in the late 19th century, many of them actually opened boarding houses called zungas.
Zungas. What are those?
They were more than just places to stay. They were kind of like community centers, providing food, shelter, that sense of belonging to those who had recently arrived in Rio.
So they were a vital support network for these newcomers.
They were. And these zungas, they became hotbeds of cultural expression, especially music and dance. Some of the greatest samba musicians of the early 20th century, they were actually the sons of baianas who ran these zambas.
No, the heart of samba, it was beating within these boarding houses.
In many ways, yes. And one of the most famous baianas, she was Hilaria Batista de Almeida, known as Tia Chiata.
Tia Chiata. Her name is legendary. I've seen statues, murals dedicated to her all over Rio.
She was an incredible woman. Her house on Alfandega Street, it was a hub for music and celebration. She hosted these incredible parties. They would last for days. And those gatherings are actually considered to be the birthplace of samba as we know it today.
It's amazing to think that these gatherings, fueled by music, food, and community, they actually laid the foundation for such a vibrant, enduring musical tradition.
It really is. And Tia Ciara, she wasn't alone, of course. There were countless other baianas who played a vital role in fostering this cultural fusion. And, to this day, the alas de baianas, the wings of baianas that parade in Rio's carnival celebrations, they're a tribute to those strong, resilient women who helped to shape the city's cultural identity.
What a beautiful way to honor their legacy. But you mentioned other cultural traditions that emerged from Little Africa as well. What about capoeira? How did that Afro-Brazilian martial art develop within this community?
Capoeira is another fascinating example of how enslaved people took a tool of oppression and transformed it into an expression of resistance, an expression of cultural pride. Remember, those who migrated from Bahia, they brought with them their experiences, their knowledge of navigating often violent urban environments. They needed ways to protect themselves, right? And capoeira, with its blend of fighting techniques, dance movements, music, it emerged as a way for them to do just that.
It's like a dance of defiance.
It is. And in the 19th century, capoeira, it was often practiced in public squares, out in the streets, especially around places like Praça da República, Rua Marechal Floriano, Morro das Providencia.
So it was a visible part of life in Little Africa.
It was. And while it was initially tolerated, it was eventually seen as a threat to public order. and it was outlawed.
Wow. So those who practice capoeira were criminals.
They were, and they faced harsh punishments. I'm talking physical abuse, deportation. It's incredible.
It really is. It's hard to believe that a practice rooted in self-defense, cultural expression, was actually criminalized.
Well, it reflects the fear and prejudice that surrounded Afro-Brazilian culture at the time. But despite that persecution, capoeira, it survived. And eventually, it gained recognition as a legitimate martial art, a cultural treasure. It's really a powerful symbol of the resilience and the adaptability of Afro-Brazilian culture.
It just shows you that even in the face of oppression, culture finds a way to thrive. But as we've seen throughout this exploration, the history of Little Africa, it's also intertwined with tragedy, with loss. We talked about the cementerios of Pretos Novos earlier, those heartbreaking reminders of the human cost of the slave trade. You mentioned that one of these cemeteries plays a really significant role in how the memory of slavery is being preserved in Rio today. Can you tell me more about that?
Absolutely. This brings us back to the cemetery in the Gamboa neighborhood near that Valongo area we were discussing earlier. It was used for decades until the official end of the slave trade, and then it was basically abandoned. The area was redeveloped, but the bodies buried there, they were never exhumed.
So they remain there, hidden beneath those layers of history.
They did. And it wasn't until 1996, during a home renovation project, that their presence was dramatically revealed. A family, the Guimarães family, they purchased a property on Rua Pedro Ernesto. It was adjacent to one they already owned.
So it was a purely accidental discovery.
Completely accidental. 8 years after they purchased the property, they started some renovations. And as the workers were digging, they uncovered something startling. Skeletal remains.
I can only imagine their shock. What a haunting discovery.
It must have been a really profound moment. You know, Dona Merced, the matriarch of the family, she had a feeling these weren't animal bones. She insisted on contacting experts. And the experts confirmed that they had stumbled upon a portion of that old Cemiterio de Pretos Novos.
It's like the past was literally unearthed, demanding to be seen, to be acknowledged.
You could say that.
Hmm.
And faced with this discovery, the family, they made an incredible decision.
They didn't just try to cover it up.
No. They felt a responsibility to honor the memory of those who had been forgotten for so long. They decided to dedicate the property to preserving the history of slavery in Rio. And in 2005, on May 13th, the anniversary of the abolition of slavery in Brazil, they founded the Instituto Pretos Novos, or IPN.
That's incredible. What a powerful way to transform tragedy into a place of remembrance, a place of education.
It really is. The IPN, it's a museum and memorial, but it's so much more than that. It's a space for reflection, for education, for healing.
So it's not just about preserving the past, it's about using it to inform the present, to inspire a better future.
Exactly. The IPN, they have a permanent exhibition. It tells the story of the slave trade, the lives of those buried in the cemetery. They have temporary exhibitions. They offer courses, events. They have a library open to the public.
It sounds like a really vital resource for understanding the legacy of slavery in Rio.
It is. And it's also a testament to the power of individuals, to make a difference, to ensure that the stories of those who were silenced are heard, that they're remembered.
It's truly an inspiring story, but as we wrap up this exploration of Little Africa, I keep thinking about how those stories, how they're so often overlooked, forgotten. How do we ensure that they continue to be told, that they continue to be honored?
That's a responsibility that we all share.
Yeah.
I think it starts with acknowledging the truth, confronting the uncomfortable realities of history, and amplifying the voices of those who were silenced.
It's about making sure that those stories, they're not just relegated to museums or academic texts, but that they're woven into the fabric of our understanding of the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And spaces like the IPN, they provide this vital platform for those conversations to happen, for people to really connect with this history in a meaningful way.
And it's also about understanding that these aren't just, abstract historical events. These were real people's lives, and their stories deserve to be heard.
Precisely. And it's not just about remembering the suffering, it's also about celebrating the resilience, the cultural richness, the enduring contributions of those who were brought to Brazil against their will.
It's about recognizing that profound impact that they had on shaping Brazilian society, even in the face of, unimaginable adversity. Their music, their food, their religious traditions, their spirit of resistance, it's all woven into the fabric of Brazil today.
It is. And Little Africa, It serves as a microcosm of that larger story, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can find ways to create beauty, to create community, and to create hope.
It really is. It makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. But the legacy of slavery, in our own societies.
Right. How we deal with that past, how we acknowledge it, how we address the inequalities that are still here today.
It's not an easy question,
Hmm.
but I think education is a good starting point.
Understanding that history, how it still shapes us.
Exactly. And having those tough conversations,
Mm.
you know, confronting the uncomfortable truths.
We can't just pretend it didn't happen or that it doesn't affect us now.
We have to understand the systemic racism, the discrimination, work to dismantle those systems.
And listen to the voices of those who are still most affected by these issues. Amplify those voices.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that the fight for justice, the fight for equality, it's ongoing, and it requires our attention, our action.
So it's not enough to just remember the past. We have to actively work towards a better future.
That's it. The story of Little Africa, it reminds us that progress, it's a process.
And that even in the darkest of times, we can find hope, inspiration.
The human spirit, its resilience, creativity, you just can't underestimate it.
This deep dive, it's given us a lot to think about, both about Little Africa and this broader legacy of slavery.
It's complex, multifaceted, full of pain, suffering, but also incredible resilience, cultural richness.
It's a history that deserves to be remembered, honored, learned from.